Man discovers weird creature in backyard. Scientists are baffled at what it really is. George, a 52-year-old retired mechanic, had just finished his dinner and decided to step out into the backyard for some fresh air. He often did this, enjoying the quiet moments before turning in for the night. His backyard was his pride and joy, filled with carefully tended vegetables and a small pond where he liked to watch the fish swim. But that night something felt different. A strange noise, soft, almost like a whimper, floated through the darkness. George paused, his ears strained to catch the sound again. He glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see a raccoon or maybe a stray cat rummaging around. But as he swept his flashlight across the yard, the beam caught something that made him freeze. At first he could only see a hunched shadow near the edge of the pond. It seemed to be shivering, or maybe crouching. He took a few steps closer, his heart starting to pound a little faster. Not sure if it was curiosity or fear driving him. As he got nearer, the flashlight beam revealed more. A strange pale figure, its skin almost hairless and smooth, with an odd, almost human-like face that peered back at him with wide, unblinking eyes. George's breath caught in his throat. It was like nothing he had ever seen before. Too big to be a rodent, too strange to be any animal he knew. He stepped back, almost tripping over his own feet, as his mind raced to make sense of what he was seeing. It stayed still, just watching him, as if it was as curious about him as he was about it. For a moment, the two stood frozen in a tense standoff, both unsure of what to do next. George fumbled for his phone and snapped a few photos, his hand trembling. The flash made the creature blink and shift slightly, but it didn't flee. Welcome back to PlotTwister. Before we unravel today's mystery, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you're always in the loop. George took a deep breath, then slowly backed away, not daring to turn his back on it until he reached the safety of his back door. As he slipped inside, he bolted the door behind him, his mind spinning with questions. What was this thing? And how did it end up in his quiet backyard? That night he lay awake in bed, the strange creature's image seared into his mind, knowing that his life and his quiet town might never be the same. The next morning, George sat at the kitchen table, staring at the blurry photos on his phone. He showed them to his wife, Mary, who squinted at the screen, her face growing pale. She insisted he call someone, so George reached out to his old friend Carl, who worked at the local nature reserve. Carl listened skeptically, but George's shaky voice convinced him to come by that afternoon. Carl arrived with a small team, carrying cameras, nets, and a tranquilizer, just in case. They exchanged uneasy looks as George led them to the backyard, pointing out the spot near the pond. But when they got there, the creature was gone. Only a few flattened patches of grass and a strange musky odor lingered in the air. Carl crouched down, examining the area with a serious expression, while one of his colleagues spotted a clump of wiry, translucent hair tangled on a branch. Carl carefully placed it in a sample bag, the weight of the situation finally settling on him. Despite their initial doubts, Carl's team set up motion-activated cameras around the yard, hoping to catch another glimpse of the strange visitor. As they worked, George's neighbors began to gather at the edge of the fence, murmuring among themselves. Word of George's strange discovery had spread, and now everyone wanted to see for themselves. George felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he realized how quickly this mystery was slipping out of his control. Carl left, promising to analyze the hair sample and review the footage from the cameras. That night, George sat on his porch, a thermos of coffee in hand, listening to every rustle and chirp in the dark. He kept glancing at the shadows, wondering if the creature might return. Days passed and George checked the cameras each morning, but there was no sign of it. He started to wonder if it had all been some kind of bizarre dream. But then, just as hope began to fade, Carl called with news. One of the cameras had caught something. Carl's voice was hushed, almost fearful, as he described the footage. A fleeting glimpse of a hunched figure slipping through the trees, its limbs moving in a way that seemed almost too fluid, too deliberate. Carl's words sent a chill down George's spine, and for the first time, he felt a deep unease settle in. This was no ordinary animal, and whatever it was still out there. A week later, Dr. Susan Thompson, a biologist from the State University, arrived at George's home. Carl had sent her the footage, and she couldn't resist taking a closer look herself. Susan had seen her fair share of oddities in the wild, but nothing quite like this. She set up more advanced equipment around the backyard, including some recorders and night vision cameras. Her presence added a sense of urgency, as if the mystery had taken on a life of its own. George watched from his porch as Susan worked late into the evening, adjusting cameras and jotting down notes. She kept glancing toward the shadows, her expression a mix of determination and unease. That night, as the air grew colder, the creature made its presence known again. George and Susan were on the porch when a faint rustling reached their ears. George's heart pounded as he saw it, a pale shape slipping between the trees. Susan held up her hand, signaling for George to stay still. The creature emerged briefly into the clearing, its eyes reflecting the light from the porch. It paused, sniffing the air, and then let out a strange, low sound, almost like a whistle, but deeper, more mournful. Susan pressed down a button on her recorder, capturing every note. George felt a chill crawl down his spine as he watched, the sound sending a strange sense of sadness through him. The next day, Susan reviewed the recordings with Carl, who had driven back to hear what she'd found. They listened to the eerie sounds, analyzing the patterns. Carl scratched his head, saying it almost reminded him of whale songs. But that didn't make sense out here. Susan agreed, but her face remained tight with confusion. She pulled out the hair sample Carl had taken earlier, revealing that it had unknown genetic markers. They couldn't match it to any known animal in their databases. Meanwhile, the town's curiosity had turned to nervous speculation. Neighbors gossiped about what George might be hiding, and some whispered about calling in the authorities. George tried to ignore the murmurs, focusing instead on the strange connection he felt to the creature. He had started leaving food near the pond, fruits, raw fish, and noticed that by morning they were gone, leaving only faint footprints in the mud. As the tension grew, George realized that he and the creature were caught in a delicate dance, each learning more about the other, while the rest of the world waited for answers. But the more he learned, the more questions seemed to surface, deepening the mystery that now surrounded his once quiet backyard. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, George noticed something new. The creature had come closer to the house than ever before. It crouched at the edge of the porch, just beyond the reach of the dim porch light. Its eyes locked on George through the darkness. George's hands trembled slightly as he set down a plate of fish, inching it forward before stepping back. The creature hesitated, then shuffled closer, its movements slow and deliberate. For the first time, George got a clear look at its face, its eyes wide and dark, filled with a strange intelligence. Susan arrived just as the creature disappeared back into the shadows, and George rushed to tell her what he'd seen. Her expression turned serious, and she hurriedly checked the camera footage from earlier. The images revealed something astonishing. The creature wasn't just sulking around aimlessly. It seemed to be watching George, observing his movements, almost as if it were studying him. Susan replayed the footage over and over, a furrow deepening between her brows. Whatever this thing was, it seemed to recognize George, as if it understood that he wasn't a threat. Meanwhile, the town's curiosity had turned to unease. Rumors spread that George was hiding something dangerous. Some neighbors even confronted him, demanding answers. George tried to keep his composure, insisting that everything was under control. But behind closed doors, he felt the pressure mounting. He confided in Susan, who shared his concern, but couldn't hide her fascination with the creature's behavior. It was learning, adapting, and most unsettling of all, it seemed to be communicating. That night, something unexpected happened. As George watched from the window, the creature began mimicking him. When he raised a hand, it slowly lifted one of its own. When he tilted his head, it did the same. Susan recorded the interaction. Her voice hushed with excitement. It was a small, strange moment, but it spoke volumes. The creature wasn't just some wild animal. It was trying to bridge the gap between their worlds. The next morning, Susan reviewed the recordings with Carl, who had returned to see the latest developments. They marveled at the creature's gestures, but the air between them was thick with worry. The more they understood, the more it felt like they were dealing with something beyond their grasp. George, too, felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. As he watched the creature retreat into the woods that evening, he couldn't shake the feeling that a decision was looming, one that would change everything. On a cold, foggy night, George stood on the porch, bundled in his thickest coat. The wind whispered through the trees, and he could feel the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on him. He stared out into the darkness, hoping to catch another glimpse of the creature. And then, as if on cue, he saw it, emerging from the shadows, moving slowly toward the edge of the pond. But this time, it did something different. It raised its head and began making a series of deep, rhythmic sounds, like a low, melodic hum that resonated through the air. Susan, standing beside him, quickly turned on his recorder. She listened, her face pale with realization. The sounds were unlike any she had heard before, yet they reminded her of the calls made by whales in the open ocean. The creature's voice seemed to echo off the trees, carrying an ancient sadness that made the hair on the back of George's neck stand up. He watched as it pointed a long, slender finger toward the sky, repeating the sound over and over. George's mind raced. Was it trying to tell them something? Was it looking for a way back home? The next day, Susan rushed to compare the recording with known marine sounds, her hands trembling with urgency. She matched the creature's calls against those of different aquatic species, and the similarities were uncanny. It was as if the creature shared a link with life from the deep sea, a connection that defied everything she thought she knew. Susan shared her findings with Carl, and they both realized that the creature's genetic markers, the odd behavior, the affinity for water, all of it pointed to something extraordinary. It wasn't just an unknown animal. It might be a remnant of an ancient lineage, something that had adapted over centuries, hidden in the depths until now. That evening, George and Susan watched as the creature made its way toward the nearby wetlands, slipping quietly into the water. They stood in silence, knowing that it was time to let go. George felt a pang of sadness, but also a sense of relief. As it vanished into the mist, the creature paused one last time, turning to look back at George. For a moment their eyes met, and George felt a strange understanding pass between them, an unspoken farewell. In the weeks that followed, the town slowly returned to normal, the mystery of the backyard visitor fading into local legend. George kept a photo of the creature tucked away in a drawer, a reminder of the time when the unknown came knocking at his door, and he chose to embrace it with open arms. What are your thoughts on the twist we uncovered today? Comment your ideas below. Make sure to like and subscribe for a daily dose of drama and mystery. See you later with another twist.